So, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Stein Horrens. I work for RAND Europe. I hope you've all enjoyed a nice but socially distanced lunch. If you haven't already done so, this is your last chance to hop into the kitchen for an extra double espresso. Because we have a packed lineup for you on this final afternoon of the European Security Summit. And it's not a light dessert. We will be discussing one of the main pillars of the EU security agenda, that of tackling radicalisation and countering terrorism, or to put it more elegantly, preventing and countering violent extremism. Before we get into a discussion with the panelists, I wanted to set the scene with some research and evidence from RAND Europe. RAND Europe is a knowledge partner of the European Security Summit. RAND is a not-for-profit research institution that aims to improve public decision-making through objective and independent research and analysis. And we will be joined by Kate Cox, who's a senior analyst at RAND, specializing in radicalization and counterterrorism research. And prior to joining RAND, she's been with RUSI, a well-known think tank in the UK, and she holds degrees from King's College and the University of Cambridge. And at RAND, Kate has led a number of fascinating and important studies on online radicalization and extremism, including the one that she will be speaking about today. She and some RAND colleagues explored how ISIL, Al-Shabaab, and Boko Haram have been using social media in Africa. So please, Kate, the digital floor is yours.
Thank you, Stein, for the introduction. And good afternoon, all. I'm very pleased to have this opportunity to present our research to this prestigious audience today. So the research that Stein mentioned was part of a study that RAND Europe delivered for the United Nations Development Programme and was one of the first publications to look at online radicalization in Africa using Twitter data analysis. So while the focus of this presentation is on the African context, there are a number of transferable insights to the European setting, reflecting the focus of today's panel. Next slide, please. Social media is increasingly central to society and to our day-to-day lives. So particularly in the current climate, people across the globe have been spending more time at home, indoors, and on social media. Next slide. Twitter is one such platform that has gained traction with 330 million monthly users across the globe, which is more than 10 times the number back in 2010. It has a wide range of uses, including political campaigning, business strategy, and the focus of this study, terrorist recruitment and propaganda. Next slide. And next slide again, please. The spread of Twitter and other online platforms in Africa has brought many benefits to the continent, driving up economic growth and increasing political participation. That said, there's also a darker side of these communications technologies, as terrorist groups can use online platforms to spread propaganda and to enlist recruits. Next slide. It's this darker side of social media that our study looks at in relation to Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram, and ISIL, three of the most lethal terrorist groups in the world. So ISIL has dominated day-to-day headlines in recent years. Boko Haram has shot to global prominence back in 2014 after the Chibok schoolgirls kidnapping, and Al-Shabaab is perhaps best known for its 2013 Westgate attacks and its more recent Mogadishu bombings. Next slide, please. So why did we decide to research online radicalization in Africa? So first, there have been growing concerns about the role of the internet in radicalization and about how extremists exploit online discussions and misinformation for their own purposes, particularly now in an era of COVID and conspiracy theories. Second, there is limited research into the issue of online radicalization in Africa specifically. So most research in this area has tended to focus more on the West, particularly in relation to ISIL, while less is known about the African context. And finally, the project offered RAND an opportunity to draw on our social media analysis capabilities and to use scalable analytics, a family of methods that is attracting a lot of attention among the wider research community at the moment. So we set out to improve understanding of how social media is used by Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram, and ISIL in Africa, drawing together our analysis to formulate a set of recommendations for policymakers. So to do this, we used a mixed methods approach, combining more traditional methods, including document review and key informant interviews, with a more innovative approach to extract and analyze primary Twitter data. Next slide, please. In terms of the study scope, we looked at 2 regional clusters, so focusing on Chad, Cameroon, and Nigeria in West Africa, and Kenya, Somalia, Sudan, and Uganda in East Africa. Next slide, please. And again, and one more, thanks. So what did we find? We found that media communications are fundamental to the operations of Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram, and ISIL. All 3 groups have a dedicated branch for media planning and use a range of online platforms to further their objectives. Many such platforms like Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook will be universally familiar, while a number of less mainstream platforms like Kik, Buzz, and Telegram are also being used by the 3 groups. Next slide. So what do the groups use social media for? So all 3 groups use it as a propaganda tool so that they can claim attacks and criticize their opponents. Al-Shabaab, ISIL, and to a lesser extent Boko Haram also use social media to attract new recruits. There is less evidence to suggest that the groups use social media to secure funding or to coordinate military planning, though there is some indication that ISIL uses it to liaise with various affiliates. So while it's clear that all 3 groups use social media, we can't look at their online activities in isolation. Internet access varies by region, and even where social media use is high, friends, family, religious leaders, and wider peer networks can also contribute to radicalization. This can be seen, for example, in the case of Sudan, where student radicalization was linked both to recruiting efforts on social media and on-campus engagement with an ISIL-inspired imam. Next slide, and one more, please. So having looked at the broader online and offline approaches of the groups, let's now focus on one social media platform in particular, Twitter. So through primary data collection, we looked at how Twitter has been used in the African countries of focus to discuss the activities of Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram, and ISIL. So focusing on dates around selected attacks between 2012 and 2017, we identified more than 220,000 tweets and recorded cases where Twitter users specifically mentioned the groups. Next slide. We analyzed this Twitter data to generate the mentions network that is presented on the slide. So here the nodes or the circles represent communities of Twitter users, with each node covering a particular theme or a particular discussion topic. So the larger the node is, the more often the users within that community mention each other. As you can see, the nodes are connected by edges, which are the curved lines connecting the circles, which represent the number of mentions between the different users. So the thicker the edges, the more mentions there are between the communities. So what does the geography look like? As you can see on the slide, we identified 5 large region-based communities discussing the groups, with each node representing a community of users. So to characterize these communities, we use lexical or content-based text analysis to identify the language used in a given community's tweets. So the first and largest of the communities presented in purple is made up of more than 12,000 users discussing Al-Shabaab. We can see this from mentions to Al-Shabaab's Twitter accounts and from the hashtags referring to the group's attacks on Garissa, Westgate, and other targets. The remaining 4 communities all focus their discussions on Boko Haram, and as you can see from the thickness of the edges, are strongly interlinked. Next slide, please. So overall, the communities are made up mostly of news outlets and social media influencers rather than official terrorist group accounts. It is particularly interesting to see that there are no large ISIL-focused communities identified through the analysis, suggesting that the online discussion about their activities in Africa during key attacks is more limited compared to the other groups. Across all three groups, we found it difficult to draw out radicalizing narratives from accounts that were directly linked to the terrorist attacks, which may be in part because these narratives were lost in the noise of media-led discussions at the time of key events. So as you can see on this slide, further to our analysis of the whole data set, we also conducted a separate analysis for subsets in relation to each terrorist group. But in the interest of time, I won't go into this in detail, with more information available in the published report online. Next slide. Next slide. So despite evidence of social media use in relation to the three groups, it appears that African governments are only now starting to address this issue. So at the time of research, the governments of Somalia, Kenya, and Nigeria had introduced wider strategies to counter extremism, but these strategies had a very limited focus on the issue of countering it online. And at the time of writing, these wider strategies were still under development in Chad, Sudan, and Uganda. Next slide, and next slide. So given the limitations of African government-led efforts in this area, we also looked at a number of transferable lessons from other countries and sectors. So in particular, we focused on interventions in the UK, in France, the US, Italy, Canada, and at the EU level, looking not only at initiatives to counter online radicalization, but also at programs to counter gang violence and illegal migration. So just to touch very briefly on some of these initiatives, next slide. Abdullah X is a UK-based counter-radicalization initiative aiming to divert young Muslims from extremism through YouTube-based video content and cartoons. Next slide. Stop Jihadisme is a French government-led initiative designed to prevent online radicalization and to educate citizens. Next slide. So End Gang Life is a gang prevention initiative in Canada using emotive video messaging to educate the public about gangs and to prevent at-risk youth from being recruited. Next slide, please. So we identified a number of good practices from these initiatives which could be considered when developing future programs to counter online radicalization. So these lessons relate to the importance of using visual tools from popular culture, such as cartoons or animations, to engage with youth, targeting campaign messaging across multiple platforms, sectors, and stakeholder groups to increase visibility, and engaging with community actors to ensure that messaging is sensitive to local contexts. Next slide. Next slide. So based on the findings discussed, we developed a set of recommendations for the 7 African governments. Next slide, please. Firstly, we recommended that each government develops an overarching national strategy for countering online radicalization where not already present. Secondly, to support strategic implementation, we propose that each government develops on-the-ground programs to counter online radicalization, reflecting good practices from other contexts in terms of highlighting the value of diversifying programs to increase their reach. So, for example, using multiple languages and online platforms, as well as targeting messages across sectors. And finally, we recommended that each government shares lessons on what works at the national, regional, and international levels, particularly given that social media is borderless and the 3 groups operate in a number of countries. So this could take the form of annual regional roundtables, conferences, or working groups, as well as the creation of new online communities to increase cooperation. Next slide, please. So while the focus of this particular research has been on the African context, there are transferable insights and lessons that can be taken from the report for PCVE in Europe. So the study sheds light on how international terrorist groups leverage social media to radicalize individuals and shows how social media analysis can be used to identify online communities discussing extremist groups and their narratives. So an evidence-based understanding of these issues is critical to designing effective responses, particularly at a time when so many people are online and consuming social media content. Thanks very much for your time and attention, and I hope you find this afternoon's discussions interesting and informative. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kate. That's really fascinating and a really useful insight into the role of internet in spreading extremism. If you allow me, just a quick question, a quick follow-up question. You focused on Africa and on African terrorist groups. How would you say the findings of your study would compare to the context of Europe?
Thank you for the question. I think in both contexts, I mean, looking at some of the previous research that RAND Europe has done on radicalization in the digital era as well, both studies show that it's important not to underestimate the role of friends and family in the radicalization process. So while social media is getting a lot of attention, there are these offline influences that play an important role as well. I think another kind of common finding across the two, so focusing on the European context as well, is that the internet really acts as this borderless echo chamber for radicalizing narratives. So that's another kind of common theme that's been emerging across the two. Yeah. In terms of research that's available, I mean, there tends, in the European context, there is more existing research on online approaches to countering this issue, so takedowns, counter-speech, and fact-checking, along with their relative merits and shortfalls. So that's an interesting avenue for exploration too.
Thank you. That's interesting. And it also goes to show a phenomenon or a term I've heard earlier on this summit, that of a false dichotomy between offline and online, that they both go hand in hand in terrorism and radicalization. All right, thank you so much, Kate. Moving on to the next item on our agenda. So next month, we'll be commemorating the 5th anniversary of the Paris attacks, which left 130 dead and more than 400 people wounded in the Bataclan Theatre and other locations in Paris, which is a vivid reminder of the terrible consequences of violent extremism in Europe. Yet tackling terrorism is one of those classic wicked policy problems that governments are faced with. It's nearly invisible, or at least until it's too late. It's hard to capture it in statistics, and it doesn't respect any administrative or national borders. So, but yet it does threaten one of the fundamental principles of the European Union, and that is being able to live in freedom, security, and justice. Now, despite the international nature of violent extremism, it's the member states who are responsible for their own national security, of course, and it's the member states who are in charge of designing and implementing interventions to tackle radicalization. The role of the Commission and the EU is to coordinate and to support member states in their efforts to help and ensure to exchange information, intelligence, and knowledge and good practices. Therefore, in this panel session, we'll be discussing some of the successes and potentially some of the challenges ahead of the work done at EU level. And what better way to kick off that discussion by hearing from Europol, which is the agency in charge of law enforcement cooperation in Europe. And hence, I wanted to introduce our first speaker, our keynote speaker, Wil van Gemert, who's a Dutch national and has had a 3-decade-long career in law enforcement, starting as a police officer in Amsterdam and having various functions and leadership positions within the Dutch police force. In 2004, he moved to the National Intelligence Agency, becoming director for national security and subsequently cybersecurity. And since 2014, he's been the deputy director of Europol and head of the operations department, where he manages a department of experts, specialists, and analysts dealing with the serious and organized crime, as well as terrorism and cybercrime. Wil, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Stein. Thank you also for this nice introduction. And thank you, Kate, also for giving an inside view on your research, not only for the comparison that could be made with Europe, but also for giving insight in what's happening in a region that becomes more and more important for us. So in this keynote of 10 minutes, I would like to focus on some elements, but not before thanking the organization to bring us as a panel together. I think all of us are having a role in as being stakeholders for fighting in this phenomenon. So much appreciated to have the opportunity to speak to you and to discuss with also the audience. Let me also, in my contribution, start with describing a little bit on the threat, following by the overview of what your polls and your response would be, and also indeed highlighting and finishing with some challenges. Well, if you look at the development of terrorism attacks, they have been decreasing over the recent years. If you look into 2019, we had 119 attacks, compared to 129 in 2018 and more than 200 in 2017. Roughly half of the member states were involved in this kind of attacks. So this seems to be good news because it's decreasing, but it doesn't not necessarily reflect the workload of law enforcement. It could say something about improved cooperation anyway, but I leave this for you to decide. The high share of failed plots among jihadist and right-wing terrorist attacks should be noted because that's clearly different from the past. If you look at our recent TSAT report, we reported 7 jihadist terrorist attacks that happened in the European Union, but 14 attacks that were thwarted. And this clearly shows that there is a success, but there is also a persistent threat. In addition, I think some violent extremist activities were not always reflected in statistics due to legal considerations, but also classification of incidents in different member states. Then, if you look at the developments of terrorism, they're also affected by what we all are affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, especially when we talk about the radicalisation process. So let's start with the positive news in this. It seems safe to assume that the containment measures also hamper the activity of terrorists and extremists. Surely difficulties in procurement, in training, opportunities in identifying targets. However, on the other side, I think people are also forced to spend more time at home and are likely to spend increased time online, where they are more likely to and could be exposed to extremist content, as we've seen in the study also. And looking at the last month's propaganda of the various scenes, they all addressed in one way or the other the COVID pandemic, trying to capitalize from it. Extremists of all different orientations are using the pandemic to propagate misinformation and perceived social division. So, as an example, right-wing extremists blame the emergence and the spread of the pandemic on foreigners and minorities, and even suggest using the virus to voluntarily infect minorities. Also, the idea that the disease is the invention by the elite to control the population has been promoted among right-wing extremists, and they are at that team joined by anti-vaccination activists that we see more and more in our European environment. New conspiracy theories also have been observed, such as the one linking the COVID-19 pandemic to the installation of the 5G technology, because of the fact that we had several arson attacks against antennas in member states. And the strange thing is that this was supported by propaganda coming from both right-wing and left-wing extremists. Finally, the increased anti-government sentiments in the context of the economic crime that we will be facing at the moment will have the potential to fuel the radicalization of some individuals, regardless of their ideological background. So as a conclusion on where we are, the picture was complex, it's getting even more complex, and the result will be probably not seen yet, but will come in the coming months and years. So what's another response? Let me also, as Stein already said, Europol and the ECTC is working on a broad level, but I will focus on the counterterrorism and radicalization online. Because Europol has become the central repository for law enforcement information in the European Union on terrorism, but also on organized crime. And the ECTC was set up in 2016 under the lead of one of my colleague panel members, and developed into the central hub for the information exchange. And just to give you an example, in 2019, the ECTC has supported more than 630 CT operations in the member states and with our third parties. At this moment, we already up to 500 different investigations. And it goes without saying, I think, that the timely international cooperation is crucial. And the online component of terrorism adds an extra layer of complexity to this challenge, in particular with regard to engage with private parties and the collection of information that's needed for evidence. Terrorists and extremists produce and also disseminate large volumes of propaganda across a vast range of online service providers. In doing so, they leave a digital footprint and information that can be instrumental for investigators, both as an intelligence lead, but also in a later stage as an evidence in there. As a result of this, OSPs hold huge amounts of personal data relevant for criminal investigations that often involve different national legal frameworks. And there you have already one of the complex elements in there, not only in the EU, but beyond. And in this domain, we tried as Europol to play an instrumental role by creating the EU Internet Referral Unit, the EU-IRU, with a twofold task. First of all, to support the member states on their online investigation, and secondly, by reducing the accessibility to online propaganda via referrals of terrorist content online, referrals made towards the providers. And to really develop this task, over the 3-4 years that the IRU is existing, we developed effective cooperation with OSPs. Currently, we are engaging with more than 360 different OSPs. And this operation has not only benefited Europol and law enforcement and the referral activity, but it also has contributed to develop awareness in the specific law enforcement area towards the OSPs, but also improve the capacity of the OSPs to address terrorism online. And as a result of this, I think also the providers become increasingly keen on cooperating also with Europol, including those who were historically reluctant to engage with law enforcement, like Telegram. This becomes manifest more or less in what we have on a regular basis we call the referral action days, in which both member states, providers, and Europol participate. So to give you an example, most recently we organized a referral action day targeting online jihad propaganda on almost 30 platforms in or addressing the Western Balkans, and disseminated in the language of the Western Balkan countries. And this makes also, as an example, clear that there should be also involvement of an organization as Europol. Then we have the project of Sirius, in which we try to teach and educate law enforcement officers how they could get information. And one of the newest things that we have developed is an app that will be available for those 4,000 people connected in the form of a game to be very, let's say, also make use of the recent knowledge, how to bring knowledge towards our investigators. Another result of the work is also that OSPs have now to take proactive measures against potential abuse. Before even networks are using their platforms, also in exchanging information in this. And therefore I have to say that the EU Internet Forum, but also the Global Internet Forum for Counterterrorism made a big difference. But I assume that Laurent will say something about this. Because they provide communication and exchange of best practices between all stakeholders and involved OSPs. And also topics related to things like content detection, crisis response, research on current and future trends, as well on policy and legislative initiatives. So, and finally, I want to brief also one of the developments being the EU Crisis Protocol, applied and should be applied in the direct aftermath of an attack. The protocol aims to really facilitate rapid assessment of the online impact of terrorist attacks, secure and timely share of critical information between EU member states, competent authorities, and other stakeholders, but also ensure an effective coordination and the management of the crisis. And the protocol was developed, of course, in the aftermath of the Christchurch attack, where violent footage was spread during the internet, even during the incident. We are coordinating the implementation of the EU Crisis Protocol in order to support member states by doing things like a tabletop exercise. Now, finally, what are the challenges? And there are a lot of them, but I only will limit myself to two of them. First of all, I think in order to really boost our role as central point of contact, we have to be better in the position to engage with private parties, to assist and also to transmit and to share relevant data in order to make both work of the providers and law enforcement more easy. And in that way, I think there is currently a revision of the Europol mandate ongoing, and I hope that at the end we will be able in a better position to do so. And finally, it's also coordinating and setting up technical platforms. And a key project that we are developing together with the Commission is called Percy. It's a platform to tackle content online in communication, but also coordination tool for referrals and removal orders. And in that way, I think we develop and we contribute to the implementation of both legislative proposals regarding terrorism content online, but also the daily work of our colleagues in the different member states. Well, I think what has been developed as a really the final conclusion so far is synergy between member states, between EU agencies and third parties, and the private sector for sure. And all of them have a task in trying to be proactive, performing activity on preventing social media being a real instrument for terrorism to radicalize people. Well, that ends my contribution for the moment. Happy to take any questions, but Stein, back to you.
Thank you very much, Bill. Very interesting. Let me follow up with a couple of questions I have myself. I don't know if you've had the chance to listen to Commissioner Johansson's talk earlier today, but she also referred to an expansion of the mandate of Europol along the lines of what you suggested, particularly in being able to receive information from organizations in the private sector. I was wondering, can you perhaps clarify or give an example of how that is currently difficult, or how your work is being hampered, and why such an expansion of the mandate would be helpful?
Well, let me give you one example, and I will take an example not directly on this topic, but on another topic in which we cooperate with the private sector, the financial institutions in there. What we see with the overview, the helicopter view that we are able to construct is that there are some certain methods and elements of crime that you could identify, also making use of either providers or, in this case, the financial investigation or the financial institutions. We are hindered at the moment to really give that inside view because we have to take away all data related towards, let's say, identification of persons. So it means that we can come up towards the level of, let's say, a modus operandi that at the end seems to be much more important than reporting a lot of usual transactions and things like this, because if you take the inside view of law enforcement, you can really detect in the system of financial investigations or financial institutions or providers the real nodes that make the difference and are part of the criminal infrastructure, the criminal business. There we see a lot of hindrance at this moment to share information that we would like to share that would help also the institutions to be more effective instead of making a lot of unusual transactions that we are also not able to follow up. So there is a big dilemma, I think, that we really have to solve. And this example is an example that you just could translate towards the providers in the same way.
Thank you. That's helpful. So earlier you were also talking about the Internet Referral Unit, the IRU. You mentioned that you've dealt with 360 different service providers over the past year, and in doing so, I understand you flag online extremist content to the service providers such as YouTube and Google. I can imagine it's pretty hard to say whether this actually has an impact on the prevalence of terrorist propaganda on the internet. There might be, a waterbed effect where you push down and it emerges on other platforms. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? How you know that it's an impact?
Well, indeed, it's a fair question. I mean, we started 4 years ago. We started with Facebook and Twitter and thought we would be able to be successful. But we ended up like now with more than 360 different providers. It's probably not the amount of referrals that we make. If you look at the past years, I think we have something like 120,000 referrals that for 90% are taking up and taking over. But the real effect is twofold. First of all, the understanding of law enforcement into the role and the possibilities of social media, on one hand to radicalize, on the other hand to be used also in criminal investigation. That's the first important, I think, lessons that we learned. The second one is related to what I tried to explain. It's not about that referral coming from Europol, but the inside view and the pressure also coming from the society towards those providers to take up their responsibility, that they learn how to deal with it. And they also, as part of this engagement, I think, also the industry came up with the need to coordinate between themselves. Because if there is a certain, let's say, person or account in Facebook, it probably could also be in all kinds of other, let's say, providers. Why not share this with each other if you're sure that this is part of a radicalization process? So they came up with something like this. So I think the benefits is not in the amount of Twitter accounts that have been taken down. We are more successful because one Twitter account can lead to more than one. So one referral can have an impact. But I think the biggest success is the inside view, and also trying to learn from each other in developing real, let's say, something against the radicalization online.
Thank you very much. Okay, so thanks for those insights from Europol. Let me move on to our panel with whom we will discuss some of these matters. And we have a packed panel of experts from law enforcement and private sector. I wanted to start with Laurent Michel, who has been with the European Commission for 25 years in various roles. Amongst others, he serves as Deputy Head of Cabinet for Commissioner Malmström and Commissioner Barrot of Justice, Malmström Home Affairs. And he was Director of Migration and Protection from 2013 to 2018, dealing with the migration crisis. Since 2018, he's the Director of Security in DG Home, which is the Directorate General of Home Affairs and Migration. And in this role, he's responsible for police cooperation, which includes Europol, of course, counterterrorism, prevention of radicalization, drugs, organized crime, as well as cybercrime. Thank you for joining us, Laurent. Next up is Eric Frisinet. He's a computer engineer by training originally, and he has a PhD in computer science, if I understand well, focusing on the fight against botnets, if that's right. He's held numerous positions in tackling cybercrime for the past 20 years, and currently works for the Gendarmerie Nationale in France, where he's the head of the national focal point for the fight against cyber threats. Welcome, Eric. And last but not least, we're obliged to have Sir Rob Wainwright with us on our panel. Mr. Wainwright is currently senior partner with Deloitte, where he advises organizations on cybersecurity, financial crime, and other risks. And he's had a career of more than almost 3 decades in intelligence and policing, for which he was knighted by Her Majesty the Queen 2 years ago. In Brussels, of course, Mr. Wainwright is best known for his role as the former executive director of Europol, which he held for almost a decade. Welcome, Rob. So I want to hand the floor to Mr. Laurent Michel.
Thank you very much. I will start by your question about why Europe is dealing with counterterrorism. The competence is clear in the treaty. It's member states who are in charge of national security. So what are we doing today? You have heard what Villa said on the role of Europol, but I want to give a global overview more from a policy point of view. And in fact, what we are trying to do at European level is to prevent, protect, and support member states. So when we talk about prevent, we are preventing terrorists to access to the means to carry out attacks or to recruit people. So we have developed legislation on firearms, how to get legally a firearms, how to deal with the trafficking in firearms first, prevent them to access to firearms, prevent them to access to explosives. We have an EU legislation on explosive precursors. So if you are buying components to build an explosive, that will trigger an alert. We are trying, and that was discussed previously by Vil, the access to the internet. We are preventing them to freely access to the internet, radicalize more people, recruit, and spread their propaganda. So that's all our activity in taking down terrorist content online. We have a legislation now in the final stage to be adopted on obliging all the companies to take down within an hour terrorist content online. But beside that, we have a lot of cooperation ongoing with the companies. Last element, beyond weapons, explosive, internet, the money. We are trying to prevent them to access to the money. So we have an agreement between the United States and the EU on a terrorist financing tracking program to prevent them to access to the banking system and to trigger alerts when terrorists are funded through the normal banking system. We are working also through a number of activities with the money laundering directive, anti-money laundering directive, through the FIUnet, and so on. So that's a prevent access. Then you have all the activity that we are doing in terms of protection. So we have legislation on critical infrastructure, how to protect critical infrastructure. That is subject to revision. We hope to put forward a new legislation by the end of the year. But we're also working on new type of detection technologies. We are very good at detecting explosive or weapons in an airport. But now the threat is more in public open spaces, and how to develop technologies that can detect explosive or weapons in public open spaces. So we are engaging in that work. But we're also working on the new threat, drones, how to counteract when there's a drone attack, possibility of chemical attacks, how to detect chemical attacks, and how to deal with such a threat. So these are the ongoing activities. In terms of support, we are supporting, first of all, the exchange of information to make sure that the information is at the right place. So we need to have the right IT tools. So that's the Schengen information system, which is at the borders. Every border guard in the Schengen area has access to all the data, and we need to make sure that the data on terrorists are there, so that if someone enters the EU, is subject to the right procedure when entering the Schengen area. But of course, we need also to ensure that the Europol information system is well fed with relevant information, and that Europol can support the ongoing investigation by the member states. So build the right IT system and make sure that the information is there. Of course, we are supporting the development of Europol with the money, but also with the means, legal means. And as was mentioned before, we are now in the process of revising the Europol mandate. We are also supporting a different number of networks, such as Atlas, which is the network of special intervention units, the one we're coming when there's a terrorist attack. And having joint training, having even joint activities when there's a terrorist attack in the cross-border operation. So, as you can see, we have a number of activities in support of the member states. I will stop here because I think I am within my 5 minutes, and happy to go into details later on. Thank you. Okay.
Tina from the National Police in France.
Yes, good afternoon from the Gendarmerie Nationale indeed. Thanks for having me this afternoon. I'm very happy to be able to exchange on this issue. I will be talking from the point of view of a cyber expert. We're supporting the investigations of specialists in fighting terrorism and radicalization. And I have three main points, very similar to what has been said, and I will conclude on very quickly on future challenges. First, of course, we've been having since 2015, of course before, but very much so since 2015, on the distribution of harmful content, violent content on the internet related to terrorist activities, the distribution of propaganda. Social media are often mentioned, but also on other platforms such as internet messaging, and actually sometimes specific apps that are developed by terrorist groups. We've investigated a couple of those apps in France. And one other issue is, as has been mentioned, the financing of terrorist activities by advertising on social media or on those other platforms, those fundraising campaigns using cryptocurrency addresses to raise funds. So what are the few challenges that we've been facing regarding those issues? The first presentation was very interesting on the mechanisms of radicalization in as seen in Africa. Of course, the specific features of social media, the viral aspects of discussions of how the messages are spread is important to be looking at. What we call in France algorithmic entrapment, or what you could call filter bubbles on social media, that cause isolation of people inside a bubble of knowledge, a bubble of issues, and that makes them focus on the issues towards radicalization, towards extremism. It's important to understand how it works and maybe try and identify ways to fight against them. The removal of the content itself is very important. The issue of the speed of that removal is of a large essence. We have the same issue with phishing, with all aspects of distribution of malware. It is very similar. You need to be very fast. It's in a few 15 minutes, 30 minutes, 1 hour that the content is clicked on, and that's when it's really useful to remove the content. So we need to keep working on that, and the EU IRU specifically has been very helpful looking at this, and all the work exchanging with service providers that has been mentioned. Now to conclude this introduction from my side, a few trends and challenges that we're looking at for the future, and actually the present. We're not only looking at Islamic terrorism, of course, we're also looking at far right or far left extremism, hate speech in France and in Europe, and how they are fueling violent actions against migrants, for instance, against telecommunications infrastructures sometimes. We'll also be looking at the way cyber weapons could be used by terrorist groups, by radical groups in the future, and there has been a sad event in Germany that shows that it is a possibility that people will be harmed by the use of cyber weapons, as has been shown in Germany. And this leads me to three last topics. There's a large relationship between propaganda mechanisms and the use of fake news, and the study of fake news and the way you fight against it is very important, and that's why we also do some research on counter speech, and some of the French initiatives were mentioned. And the last aspect is automatic removal of identical content, which is a difficult issue that we are looking forward to work more with service providers, because content keeps being copied, and when it's really illegal content, harmful content, it should not be kept online. Thank you.
Last but not least, Sir Rob Wainwright, please go ahead. Your initial remarks.
Thank you, Stein. Pleasure to be here. Pleasure to be with some former friends and colleagues as well. Well, listen, as I step back and think about what reflections I have on the challenge we have from terrorism today, I think Will and others quite rightly made a remark about the rising prevalence, it seems, of far-right extremism. That should be a concern, but of course, I still think that it's the current form of international terrorism, perhaps, that still takes our dominant focus, and that's a current form that's been shaped in recent years, of course, by the series of iconic attacks from 2015 onwards. That's been mentioned already in Paris, Brussels, London, and of course many other cities around Europe, and they are significant still today, very much so, for two reasons, I think. One, the way in which those attacks illustrated the dawn, I think, of a new age, a new era in international terrorism, towards one that is a threat much more impacted by the effects of globalization and technology. It was the time when finally terrorism moved into the digital age, perhaps in a way that cybercrime and other forms of crime already had done so. So the idea of online jihadism, we've talked about this already, how social media platforms were exploited to great effect, at least for a period of a few years, as a recruitment and propaganda tool, of course, as a model of inspiration for indeed others, so-called lone actors, to carry out also very, very damaging attacks. Also, though, in terms of the exponential growth in cross-border dimensions of terrorism, it's always been a feature, of course, of certain forms of international terrorism by its very nature. But I think during this period, and what we saw with this phenomenon of foreign fighters being radicalized and coming back in large numbers, presenting such a major dimension of the threat in Europe, showed, I think, a form of terrorism that was more globalized, as I said, and more cross-border in nature. And taken together, therefore, these two dimensions of technology and globalization represented, I think, a truer sense of international terrorism than we've seen before. I think the other main reason why these attacks are important is because, as Laurent and others have talked about, the events themselves trigger the development of a more activist EU agenda on counterterrorism. Of course, the gravity of the attacks, the impact that it had on public security, on public sentiment, of course, naturally translates itself into a democracy, into political urgency and activity. And that certainly has been the case. And of course, a lot of initiatives have emerged since then in the way that Will and others have been describing too. Of course, the way in which that whole confrontation from online jihadism, was translated into the EU Internet Forum, and the great work that Europol is doing with social media partners. And of course, many other forms of strategy, many other strategies, an increase really in our ability to track terrorist finance, for example. And I think as I reflect on that period and since, we see a more activist agenda, largely one that's been successful, I think, in mobilizing a greater, more concerted response between the member states and the European institutions, and to a certain extent, other stakeholders as well. But that said, let me end with a minute or so on what I think are still are the challenges that have also been revealed through that experience, notwithstanding the fact that for a couple of years now I've not been as directly involved as I was in the past, of course. I think this idea about where the competence lies, and a number of, I've mentioned this already, you're quite right, Stein, Laurent, of course, the treaty is quite clear about the so-called sole competence of national security issues in the hands of member states. I think that's right. I think it will probably always be the case, frankly. But Laurent is right that this, the way that I've been describing, the urgency of the situation required the EU nonetheless step in a more preventative and supporting role. On the ground, as well knows at the time, as I knew, as I'm sure is still the case, that translating through into a seamless cooperation between an agency like Europol and the intelligence and security agencies of the member states actually never quite transpired in the way that we have seen in other areas. And there are some understandable reasons for that, but I think getting a much more joined up collaborative model, even within public authorities on terrorism, remains a challenge. And that's reflected also in terms of information exchange. That's even before we begin to think about how we can have better public-private partnerships, and this has been mentioned already. The obvious example, social media partners that I mentioned, others that I mentioned, the financial sector, of course, in tracking terrorist finance. Again, here, having worked now much more closely with business executives over the last 2 years, I see there is a lot more potential in this area as well, significantly more. I don't think that the nature of that collaboration is systematic and consistent enough, despite the promising signs in one or two areas that we've been talking. So I think there's more that we can do to get that in the right space, to leverage the best of public and private partners in helping us to combat this more modern, aggressive form of terrorism that we're living with. There's also, and I'll end on this point, there's also a responsibility that those in the EU institutions, national public authorities have in making sure we keep the issue alive of combating terrorism. For example, in the minds of business executives who, in the meantime, have become almost overwhelmed by the effects of the pandemic, and even in this area of security and risk are more affected by the day-to-day concerns of cybercrime and, for example, financial crime. Terrorism is still a problem, as we've been hearing today, and we need to keep that still, as I said, alive in the minds of all of our stakeholders. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you so much, Mr. Wainwright. So if I may start with you, just with a follow-up question. I mean, you were in charge of Europol for almost a decade at a time, as you said yourself, when Europe faced a number of really high-profile, deadly attacks. Charlie Hebdo, Paris, Brussels, London, Manchester. And you've overseen, the enormous expansion in the role of EU action in this space and law enforcement cooperation in response. What is the lesson, or what are the lessons that you've taken from this, and perhaps that you've given your successor, Catherine de Boll?
Well, I don't think Catherine needs any lessons from me. She's doing a good enough job without that. I think the lessons that I took before, as I was leaving, was that the nature of terrorism and crime today, as I've been describing, has become so much more globalized that we cannot possibly succeed without a more collaborative approach. So the essence of a European agency like Europol becomes more important. The essence of coordinated strategic response from the European Commission and other actors becomes also more essential. And secondly, that at a practical operational level at Europol, as Will very well knows, because he made this happen on the ground so well, is you make that happen through the power of data and data exchange. And it becomes a data-centric, data-powered model, leveraging the effects of data network economy, and it's bringing more and more actors together with their data in order to really see the broad picture of what's happening. So I think this is a story about how a data-led, transformative and collaborative model can help us respond to threats like terrorism. And the second lesson I'd say is none of that can happen without the kind of political leadership that we saw in the wake of 2015 and on, by commissioners certainly, and also, of course, interior ministers in leading member states. So it's the combination, I think, of getting that political leadership and what I've been describing, leadership in the business sector as well, with the ability of Europol to get on with the job and envisage more practical outcomes that can really impact on the problem of terrorism.
Yeah, thank you. Mr. Van Gemert, do you want to follow up on that? Or?
Yes, I would like to, and also more or less, well, in line with what Rob already said, I think on the data-led approach, that's really, I think, the way to go for the future. Every terrorist attack, but also every big investigation delivers nowadays tons of data that can be and should be relevant. And even now we have, let's say, information that 5 years later suddenly becomes important because of connections that have not seen at that moment, because indeed the terrorist threat is an international threat, a threat that's connected throughout a lot of different actors and organizations, and that means that in hindsight you see potential leads for investigations and also suspects in there. I would add one thing that because you asked what have we learned, so data, that's indeed a subject for especially for Europol. But the second part is also that we have to come towards combined active investigative activities. We call it task forces. We learned from cyber, to be honest, also in the terrorist field, and now also in the organized crime field, that if you bring specialists together that deal with an issue, and in cyber it's also clearer, like when there is an issue on bulletproof hosting, it's never one country or one place that's responsible. And if you sit together with specialists, then you can identify the best way to act on an issue that will benefit, from which everybody will benefit. So we came up in the terrorist field what we call the Terrorist Identification Task Force. It's more or less a boiler room in which we bring for 1 week together different member states with their investigative leads in a certain field or certain topics. And we bring, working them together, we bring all the support of the data that Europol can bring. And by doing this together, we enrich the picture so much that even totally new inside views are coming. And this kind of development leads at Europol to be very practical, where we always had operational rooms, but now we have to have cooperation rooms in which we really can sit for a week together with 5 or 6 member states with different agencies working with. So it's not only data-driven, it is also a new way of working, and you need that let's say, above member states individual approach.
Thank you. Mr. Michel, you've outlined the Commission's approach to tackling violent extremism quite well. There's the EU counterterrorism strategy that has those 4 pillars of prevent, protect, pursue, and respond, which you've laid out very clearly. Counterterrorism is one of the 3 pillars of the EU agenda on security, and we've had the directive on combating terrorism. Yet, was it in 2018 that the European Court of Auditors released this report that applauded the Commission's approach to tackling terrorism, but also flagged a number of areas for improvement. Would you like to reflect on how the Commission is taking forward some of those recommendations? Oh, sorry, you're on mute.
Okay, sorry. No, I think the challenge is more what Rob and Will have been describing, and we need to have better cooperation, better exchange of information, and there's still a big divide, big gap between the intelligence community and the law enforcement community, and we still see some gaps. And at national level and at European level. And that's something that we cannot afford today. But for me, the biggest challenge for law enforcement is encryption, end-to-end encryption. We are moving more and more into end-to-end encrypted world, where the access to the data is more challenging. So that's one of the issues where the policymakers have to intervene and make sure that the companies allow the access to the data, being when we move to 5G, being with encrypted messagery, and so on. You have seen a recent success story against organized crime with EncroChat, which was led by the French gendarmerie and Dutch police, and with the support of Europol. This is a major breakthrough, and because we have access to the data, so we need to have access to the data. And the biggest challenge at European level is the data protection environment that we are living in, and the data privacy community, which does not understand the need of the law enforcement community to fight terrorism or organized crime. And that's the question needs to be changed, and that's one of the main challenges. The other challenge, of course, is in terms of terrorism, is what we do with the people who are leaving prisons now, the prison leavers, who have been radicalized, and the French fighter who will come back or are coming back to Europe. So you end up with an environment with well-trained people, with battlefield experience, and how to deal with them. And that's also a challenge that we have to deal at European level. So that's really, for me, the current challenges. Thank you.
That's interesting. Thank you. Mr. Frisinet, perhaps can you add to that in terms of what you see are the main challenges at national level? We've heard a lot about the European level, much around cooperation between private sector and the government, as well as coordination between member states and the EU level. Can you reflect a bit on the challenges you're facing at national level?
Yes, very quickly. Mr. Michel just mentioned the issue of access to data, and we just had a decision from the European Court of Justice. So I'm going back to Europe on data retention that was looking at the existing regime in France for data retention, and actually a difficulty with current EU legislation on data retention and potential harm to ongoing investigations, including the ones dealing with terrorism. So we still need to be looking at that. One other issue is regarding how you convey messages to the public. We talked about the radicalisation process and how you try to fight that through counter speech, actually through a positive speech. There has been some experiments in France, and we actually need to exchange more in Europe. And I'm moving away from the specific French issues, but look at experiments in other countries and see what works best in other countries to really improve how we deal with that, because it's not working in all situations. Maybe it needs to be adapted very locally, and related also to social work very locally. So it's not just an issue of content on the internet, it's also an issue of social workers and all the people who are working towards this. The issue of end-to-end encryption is interesting. We also need to be still exchanging with service providers at a very technical level. Even if there is encryption, even if there is security and protection of privacy, which is needed, we need to be able, in some circumstances, to cooperate to gain access to more information during the investigations, and there's an issue of trust between law enforcement and part of the industry, and we still need to be working on that at an international level as well.
Stein, if I could comment on what Eric said, because, and indeed Laurent, they talked about, quite rightly, the impact of end-to-end encryption on one hand and data retention, this important ruling by the European Court of Justice last week. I think they both, of course, are symptomatic or symbolic, rather, of a change of in the way in which we're rapidly moving into a digital experience, of course, and how privacy and data ethics more generally is becoming a driving factor for legislators as well as the court and for industry as well. How end-to-end encryption is an evolution of the way in which digital tools are being developed, and both of those, I think, present very sizable challenges to law enforcement, as we've been hearing. We have successes like EncroChat that's been mentioned, and my congratulations to those involved. That was a fantastic operation. They are not so often in this space because it's so difficult. But there is something, when you think about that, the trend seems pretty clear that we are going to increase the rate of digital connectivity and digital expansion, and in which encryption will become a part of mainstream business life. We are going to increase our sensitivity around data ethics and what that means, therefore, for privacy. And so the question is, what does the future of law enforcement in the digital space look like? I hope, yes, with much closer collaboration, so we can repair the trust that Eric had said that between law enforcement and private sector. But there's also something, as Will knows, about how we permanently have to reinvent the way in which we carry out our investigations. I think this is a very challenging, but probably a seismic time for what the future of law enforcement will look like 10 years from now.
Do law enforcement agencies, at EU level, Europol, as well as national level, and perhaps local level, do they have the capacity? And going forward, is there a sufficient development in the skills required to tackle these challenges?
Well, Stein, if I can take that question and also respond a little bit to what Rob was saying about the development and the importance of data. Indeed, I think we have to realize, all of us, that the COVID also leads to an acceleration of let's say, the use of technical and social media and the way we have to adapt towards this activity. And it's accelerated not once or twice or 3 times as fast, but even much more in there, I think, at the end. And it gives also a new picture for threat, but also for the need of law enforcement to adjust. And there, I think, even when we are now trying to adjust ourselves in the normal speed that we had towards the need for law enforcement by being able and being allowed to handle big data, on the legal process, it leads to a legal process that will take years, to be honest. So, and we're very grateful for the Commission that they took up the challenge to change the regulation of Europol of 2017. And in 2020, we're already changing it, but it will take us at least a year before it's active. That's not the time that we have, to be very honest. So also as a society, we have to adapt towards this because of the acceleration we had because of COVID. Are we ready? Are we able to do so? I think there are always front runners and people and also law enforcement agencies that don't have the capacity at that moment. But by bringing it on the international level, like with EncroChat was done, we are able to support not only the French and Dutch police, but support a global activity of law enforcement. More than 1,000 arrests only in the UK, more than 600 investigations started from this, not only in France and in the Netherlands, all over the globe. So the impact and the possibility to do so is enormous. I'm only concerned about the time between the need for change and when it really comes true. But well, probably Laurent can say something about this also.
Laurent? You're on mute, Laurent.
Yeah. try to prevent the echo. Yes, legislation takes time, and we will come up with revised mandate for Europol by December, but then it needs to be negotiated in the European Parliament and in the Council, and it takes at least a year. We have seen that in these topics, we are talking about the society, the values, the ethics. And if you look at the legislation that we have put forward on terrorist content online, we have been discussing with the European Parliament now for 2 years, and the legislation is still not yet adopted. And we're still discussing on the definition of the content that can be taken down. And so these are very sensitive discussions because it's the value of our democracy which is at stake. So we need to reach the right balance. So it's true that criminals and terrorists are often ahead of us, but we need to set up the right legislation. But once it's there, we have the tools to operate. So I'm optimistic. It will take time, but we will reach a positive result at the end of the work.
Thank you, Laurent. Are there any of the? We have a very shy audience at the moment, so I'll just carry on myself. But I think we're ending. We're towards the end of our session. Are there? Is there anyone who wants to add a few closing thoughts to this panel before we go on to the next session?
Fine, if I may. Yeah. On the issue of data exchange, the way we see people in the cybersecurity environment exchanging information is really way ahead of what we're able to do in law enforcement in practice. Not only because of legislation, but also because of the way we tend to work usually. So we need to be more agile, to have platforms and protocols for the exchange of information, and Europol is there to help us build that, but we also need to have the will to do it, and that's very important. And as for access to data, there's also the e-evidence directive and relative text at the more international level that need to move forward, and it is still too slow in practice for us at a national level.
Thank you very much, Eric. On that note, I think we've heard that there's a lot has been done over the past years. Quite a few successes, some highlighted here, but we've heard that it's important to be agile, to quote Eric in his last words, and ensure that there's sufficient information sharing, not just between law enforcement agencies at EU, national and local level, but also with the private sector. And there are signs that this will improve, and there's still scope for improvement in the next few years. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. It's been a pleasure. I wanted to flag that we have a next session coming up on border management, migration and customs, the new information architectures. So please stay tuned and log in again as soon as that session starts on this channel. Thank you so much.
Bye.